My name is Zach Subin. I'm going to be leading today's conversation. To ground today's conversation, I wanted to first introduce myself. I experienced Berkeley as an openly gay white grad student from the East Coast. I studied climate science and policy, mostly focusing on quantitative analysis of global climate and energy systems. I did take a class on sustainable communities in 2006, which mostly convinced me of how they were illegal to build in most of the US. I typically roomed with other students in North Oakland and Berkeley for about 10 years, mostly around the Elmwood, Temescal, and Rockridge neighborhoods, but a couple of years in North Berkeley off Gilman Street. And then I moved to SF in 2016 for work and to move in with my partner. One of my favorite parts of Berkeley was long, kind of meandering bike rides. I used to take many hours a week in the Berkeley Hills, where I generally found great views, clean air, and tree-lined streets with very few cars. Also, many obviously expensive single-family houses. So we may talk about that. I'm one of the volunteer leads for Urban Environmentalists. Our mission is to address the climate and inequality crises by transforming cities and towns into inclusive communities designed around people rather than cars. This event is also co-hosted by East Bay for Everyone, a network of people fighting for the future of housing, transit, tenant rights, and long-term planning in East Bay. So a couple more notes about today's event. So we're talking with Terry today, and we do want everyone to know about his candidacy. But we also want to remind folks that Urban Environmentalists is regionally focused, and we don't make our own local endorsements. We want to acknowledge there's at least one other pro-housing candidate in the race, Alex Sharenko, who has been an outspoken supporter of housing and climate action. Also, please note that this is being recorded. So if you don't want your name to be read with your question, make sure to click the box to ask it anonymously. So the term climate justice, which is the title of tonight's event, has many layers. Most broadly for me, it brings to mind the vast disparity between the people and the countries, and even the generations most responsible for climate pollution and those most vulnerable to its impacts. At a local level, it intersects with many other dimensions of social justice that we'll try to discuss. So now I'd like to introduce Terry Taplin. Terry is an openly gay working class Black man raised in West Berkeley who fights for racial, gender, mobility, climate, and LGBTQ justice. He is a poet, activist, and Alameda County Democratic Party Central Committee associate. He's vice chair of the City of Berkeley Transportation Commission, and he is a candidate for Berkeley City Council District 2. So I'll move on to our first question. So Terry is wondering if you could tell me how your personal experiences have shaped your political goals and values, including your interest in environmentalism, and also about some of the specific environmental challenges and opportunities of Southwest Berkeley.
Hello, everyone, and hello, Zach. Thanks for having me. Growing up in Berkeley was a big influence on my desire to become involved and also my love for the environment. In third grade, my science teacher was a big birder. The egret was his favorite bird, and I was a member of our little bird watching club. And I attended Berkeley Day Camp, so I spent my summers in Tilden and at the marina and Aquatic Park, and I actually live a few blocks from Aquatic Park. Some of our challenges, I used to serve on the Children, Youth, and Recreation Commission in about 2013, and that was the year that Tuolumne Camp burned down. And at that time, we were still thinking about Vision 2020, which is the City of Berkeley's effort to close the achievement gap for Black and Brown students by 2020, which unfortunately didn't happen. But those early experiences left big impressions on me. So where I live, it's known as our frontline community. Historically, working class Black and Brown. We abut the highway. West Berkeley is the seat of a lot of our stormwater and sewage infrastructure. And historically, the city has divested from this part of town. So we have a lot of aging roads, a lot of aging hydro infrastructure, and we're vulnerable to flooding. And those are some of the challenges. Also, the jet fuel line runs from the Richmond refinery to the Oakland airport underneath the Amtrak Railroad. And San Pablo Avenue is where a lot of the gas lines are. And so in addition to the flood hazards, we have subterranean fire hazards, and we're next to the big state highway. We've also got San Pablo Avenue, which is a state highway as well, and part of Ashby. And so just growing up down here, trying to survive as a pedestrian, and like noticing the health impacts of like, you know, my family members, my community members, made me really aware of the kind of adverse health impacts of environmental racism.
Great. Yeah, I know like every time I read the studies that, you know, the effects of air pollution on health, especially for people exposed at close distances, seem to get kind of bigger and bigger. You mentioned, you know, a lot of danger for pedestrians in the neighborhood, and you're a strong advocate for prioritizing people using transit, biking, and walking on our streets. And there have been critiques that bike and pedestrian infrastructure are sometimes promoted by white urbanists in a way that promotes gentrification or does not prioritize the needs of people of color. Especially, there's been a lot of recent conversation about the rapid implementation of slow streets during the pandemic. Do you think these critiques have merit, or what would you additional, you know, context would you add to that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenging conversation for me in particular because, like, you know, I'm one of very few like mobility advocates of color, and so oftentimes, like, you know, I think historically, like, communities of color have been excluded from planning. At the same time, you know, not every city is Berkeley. Berkeley's a, you know, relatively walkable, bikeable place. So things that work for us might not work for cities like Chicago, where, you know, that's like different. But one challenge I'm having with this conversation is that I'm not seeing a lot of people of color raising that argument. I feel like I'm seeing a lot of like mostly white folks who don't like urbanists, kind of co-opting the narrative around, you know, Black Lives Matter to advance maybe their own agendas. Like a few weeks back when Ahmaud Arbery was murdered, there was, you know, all these takes being like, oh, like, you know, like open streets aren't safe for Black folks, and that's true, but the problem is that, like, you know, public space in general isn't safe for Black folks, and like no one's saying that, like, you know, quick build or open streets are gonna solve systemic racism, but their inability to do so is being leveraged to, you know, push against safe streets, and I think, you know, I'm not sold on the. I think that there's, you know, some degree of disingenuousness sometimes, to be honest, because it's not like auto-centric planning or auto-centric infrastructure is any safer for Black folks, and, you know, those principles aren't like built around affirming Black lives either. But I do think it's important to prioritize, you know, those communities. I think Oakland's done a great job of like modifying their rollout of slow streets with feedback from the communities in East Oakland. My neighborhood is historically Black, and we have one of Berkeley's healthy streets. And during COVID, like our city staff are functioning as disaster relief workers, and you know, like I understand the suspicion around, you know, city governments using this as a way to push things through without public process, but I don't know to what extent like cities can actually like maintain public process because everyone's so like strapped for resources and time. Another thing is like in Berkeley, at least, there seems to be this like dynamic where you know, folks who aren't Black decide that folks of color, Black folks, automatically prefer vehicles. I myself have never driven. I don't have a license, and I've got a friend who's also Black, and she's like a single mom, and she doesn't drive. And both of us are like pedestrians and transit dependent. So like cars aren't really gonna save us, you know. But you know, that being said, like every city is different. Like I can't tell folks in Chicago or Minneapolis how to roll out their safe streets because I don't live there. So I think like, you know, the critiques have some merit, but I think that the conversation needs to remain centered on, you know, how do we make streets safe for everyone? And you know, slow streets are one strategy, and among others. And a lot of the conversation against slow streets rests on the assumption that they're for like white folks to recreate themselves, which that's not the only purpose. You know, I think Black folks and brown folks also deserve the right to recreate themselves. And I think that essential workers who are transit dependent or bicycle dependent deserve safe routes to their essential jobs. You know, so I think that to the extent that the critiques create more dialogue, they're useful, but if they're just, you know, an excuse to shut down urbanism or to, you know, stand and cape for cars, then, you know, sort of like, you know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I might, one thing you said I might drill down on a little bit, because this is actually a theme that kind of comes up for us a lot as urban environmentalists, trying to make changes that kind of go against the status quo, you know, to change, you know, the way our streets function, or, you know, ideas about how we do housing. So how do we balance the need for inclusive community process with the need to, you know, be deliberate about making changes and not let process sort of be derailed by, you know, voices of the privileged or people comfortable with the status quo?
Yeah, I think like expanding the ways that cities or whomever receive feedback is important, because like not everyone can go to like an 8-hour meeting in the middle of the day or late at night. So I think like the more like digital engagement, the more like, you know, if cities and folks are really serious about getting community feedback, they might have to do more work. You know, folks might have to like call people, but also like folks should be ready when a person of color says, no, I do want slow streets, or I do want bike lanes, or I do want bus lanes, because those voices are out there, and a lot of times they're erased because they're not useful to NIMBYs. So
Thanks. So moving on to the topic of housing. So, you know, we actually had a panel with Chris Jones, among other people, last fall. He's one of the researchers at UC Berkeley and UC Davis, who found that by far the top climate action to reduce emissions for Berkeley and similar cities in the Bay Area is infill housing. And the reason is that households in Berkeley that are similarly situated generate much less climate pollution than households living in car-dependent suburbs. So given the kind of great need for infill housing, what do you think are the best policies to bring us that housing while enhancing equity?
Right, I think, I think density bonuses for inclusionary housing are good. But I think that our problem in Berkeley is that we restrict multifamily construction to like largely mixed use commercial corridors. And we were not allowed to build in the neighborhoods. And so I think like missing middle housing, streamlining, projects that have, an abundance of below market rate units, and like streamlining, like also like projects that use union labor. One weird thing that happens in Berkeley is that like it's larger projects that, use PLAs, product labor agreements, and those are the ones that get like the severe pushback, but smaller scale, 2-story affordable housing buildings that don't use PLAs are able to slide through. So that's one thing that sort of like gives me a bit of pause. But I think that missing middle and infill, in addition to, building denser along corridors, is the way to go.
Do you want to define your understanding of missing middle for folks who might be newer to it?
Sure, yeah. So like duplexes, fourplexes, kind of like smaller multifamily buildings, bungalow courts. And yeah, like, these, like in my neighborhood, it used to be legal to build these things, and like Berkeley got downzoned, and now like you can't like build anything here. So bringing like, like a lot of folks see new housing or density as something that's like an emerging thing, but really it's like we would be returning to a more sustainable way that we used to build before everyone decided that they didn't want like low-income Black and brown neighbors in their nice neighborhoods in Berkeley. But if Berkeley is really a climate city, if it's a city that values fair housing, we are going to need to be able to house more families, which means, bigger buildings and corridors, bungalow courts in the neighborhoods, and apartments in the neighborhoods as well.
And what I noticed you mentioned something on your platform about supporting single family homeowners to convert their homes into multifamily housing. So it's like, I guess that's an example of sort of allowing conversion while protecting tenants, because it's sort of allowing homeowners to opt in to conversion. I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts on sort of how to protect tenants, or I know you talked a lot about sort of ownership models that are less conventional, cooperative and social housing.
Great. Yeah, two things. I think Berkeley has really strong tenant protection laws in the books, and we have a rent board, but there isn't always perfect tenant protection oversight. So like to bolster our tenant protection oversight infrastructure, making sure folks know that the rent board is there and that they can like, go there with their challenges and things. But on the other side, I'm a big proponent of like community land trusts and co-ops. And where I live, there is like an apartment of folks where the building got sold and they were going to be evicted, but one of the land trust groups was able to swoop in and like keep them and pay for the building. And so like, if we have like land trust groups, we should be supporting them by streamlining their process, helping them finance. And Berkeley we have the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and we have Measure O, and I would prioritize like those kinds of projects for those funding sources. I think moving forward with the fiscal impacts of COVID, it will be challenging to finance innovative housing solutions. But leaning into our partnerships with the folks who are able to do that work, such that they can have it, you know, it shouldn't take them 10 years to like go through the process. So expediting the process, I think.
Great. So now talking about a topic that's very top of mind. So how do you see the interaction between the urgent movement for racial justice and the movements for housing and climate justice? And in particular, how can the movements for climate action and abundant housing be better anti-racists?
Right. I think the intersection of the movement for racial justice and climate and housing, for me, it's like, okay, we have to be prioritizing housing policies that allow like existing Black tenants to remain in Berkeley, and also, you know, new Black people to move to Berkeley, whether they're students, whether they're families. And yeah, I think that like legalizing apartments will be a big part of that. And, you know, allowing like folks to expand their homes to facilitate intergenerational living close to jobs. Because like on my block, when all the jobs that supported the Black households left, the Black households followed. So making sure that there are employment opportunities for young folks, and making sure that like our existing stock of affordable housing or rent-controlled units or whatever are habitable. A lot of our buildings are old and you know, carbonized and have mold and stuff. So, you know, we have to do a lot of rehabbing, I think, of the older stock of our housing. I think that the climate, to make the climate justice movement more inclusive, I think, you know, highlighting and prioritizing, you know, like Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities is important, and really giving platforms to those voices. I think, like, you know, I'm a member of both Bay Area Sunrise and the Sierra Club, and, you know, there's a lot more folks of color in Bay Area Sunrise and the Sierra Club. But at the same time, you know, I think that like there's an opportunity to reach out to like the young folks in Berkeley, like the high school students and stuff, to get them more involved in those movements. I think is one road of address.
Great. And I guess I'll just ask one more question, and then I have lots more, but want to leave some time for audience questions as well. So kind of, you know, just thinking historically, Berkeley is known as like a bastion of progressivism, and, you know, it's spawned sort of like visible left-leaning social movements since the 1960s. Less well known is that it was the first place in the country to implement single-family zoning, and these histories intersect in a negative way in the local founding of some of the modern environmental movements by racists and segregationists such as Joseph LeConte and Duncan McDuffie. And, you know, this is something that's obviously it's history, so it's sort of been known, but a lot of people are kind of re-examining, you know, unearthing early 20th century history that has a big impact on how we think about things now. So how do you think these different strands of Berkeley sort of intersect and interact to explain where we are today, and what's your vision for the future of Berkeley?
It's a big question. Yeah, I think that like the legacy of racial exclusion, ironically, I think we see it playing out in this like kind of like reactionary repulsion to like quote unquote like, well, there's this idea that, okay, well, because of the pandemic, if we have density, people will get sick because people living together is gross. But when we peel that back, you know, the people living together that got banned back during the McDuffie era were, you know, African Americans and Asian folks. And so we see this this racist belief that people of color don't belong in like nice urban spaces. They don't belong in pristine nature. If we look at the, you know, kind of conservation movement, it's almost like if you just sort of like change the filter, you have like the same kind of NIMBYism today. Because like a lot of the folks who don't like tall buildings don't like people, and the people they don't like happen to be, you know, black and brown. As far as like the future, I mean, the only way we're going to survive is if we rethink our reliance on, you know, single family housing. Like there's just no way that that's going to be sustainable. And I think like to change the mindset of like those older folks who still hold to that, you know, we have to get them to understand that like if we keep sprawling, then all their glorious, like pristine hiking locations will disappear forever. And we're seeing, you know, we're seeing this with like the fires too. Like folks are seeing the consequence of perpetual pushing out into the fire zone. But I think that there's only so long that Berkeley can try to maintain this weird like pastoral suburban fantasy. And I don't mean to be like insensitive to folks who, you know, enjoy what they're used to, but like, you know, our generation, I mean, me at least, I've pretty much have foregone the expectation of owning a home ever. But I am invested in, you know, having a planet that will be here for people's children to grow up in. So speaking optimistically, I do think that Berkeley will have missing middle housing. I do think we'll have, you know, like dense corridors and walkable, beautiful fourplex filled neighborhoods. And I think that like another thing kind of tangentially that we deal with in Berkeley is the potential closure of the hospital, right? So what happens if hospitals close and then folks who are already far away from hospitals become even further away? And if the pandemic comes back, you know, or if it gets worse, folks are going to need to be able to access medical resources. And so housing is also a health issue. And I think that like we're going to have to really start combining the various needs that we have as cities, because fiscally speaking, we're having to choose between cutting like staff or services or capital improvements, right? And the things that will remain are going to be at the nexus of, you know, meeting various goals like climate and safety and housing. So like my vision for Berkeley's future is a more integrated, you know, inclusive, like health, housing, climate lens towards urban design and city policy.
Thanks. So just a reminder for folks to type questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them that way. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I might follow up on, you mentioned in your platform about having an eco-district. And I think it's interesting to think about ways that sort of environmental sustainability can be weaved together with sort of social and economic development. And so I'm wondering if you want to talk about that, and what is an eco-district?
Right, so an eco-district, it's the notion of a framework that integrates social equity, sustainable development, and minimizing our ecological footprint. So for example, if we are upgrading our streets, we might want to think about semi-permeable pavement, which will help us manage our stormwater runoff. You know, green building, maximizing the efficiency of buildings. More specifically to District 2, like Aquatic Park is a great example, because it's, you know, a city-made park that, you know, the like Strawberry Creek and Potter's Creek drain into it, and then the bay drains in and out. But due to like divestment, there has been such degradation of the tide tubes that this has caused like, you know, like an ecological crisis. Like last summer, there was like a surge in Enterococcus and algae and stuff. And it's also like Aquatic Park is also like the center of Berkeley's bioscience, like the bioscience ribosome we have with Emeryville. And so if we're finding ourselves needing to employ a bunch of people and fix the park to bolster it against, you know, flood risk, then, you know, investing in upgrading the tide tubes, investing in upgrading the sewage infrastructure around it, and that kind of thinking informing how we prioritize capital projects and city resources, and that kind of expanding out to the rest of the district. That's kind of like, you know, an eco-district and what it would look like in West Berkeley. And also, you know, like managing our transportation so that folks won't be relying on private auto. You know, we've got like, you know, San Pablo, we've got like bus lines, we've got Amtrak, and, you know, like we've also got some of the highest injury streets in Berkeley are down here. So making the roads safe for bicycle use and other micromobility pedestrians, getting more folks on Amtrak, getting more folks on the bus, that will help us, you know, eliminate carbon emissions from transportation, at least. So that kind of framework driving our urban design, rather than, you know, the preservation of parking lots and views.
I know like one thing that we're thinking about a lot in terms of the sort of like energy policy space is opportunities to combine climate mitigation, which is reducing emissions, with adaptation or increasing resilience. And, you know, there's a lot of examples like that come up, you know, reducing sprawl. Also, like it reduces emissions, it also reduces wildfire threats. Electrifying buildings can provide, you know, comfort during heat waves or with air pollution, and also reduce emissions. So I'm wondering if you thought about like if there's any examples that particularly apply to West Berkeley. You know, I know there's some threats from sea level rise, and yeah, if there's anything you thought about along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, like, well, for air pollution, another thing is like the highway itself. One kind of like, you know, like down the road, like hyper fantasy is like undergrounding I-80, and then retrofitting it or whatever, like, you know, upgrading it to withstand sea level rise. That's one idea. Also, I think that like one other idea is creating like a network of electric charging stations for freight. Because if we could get like electric freight going to the port, you know, that would, I think, help out a bit with I-80. And then we'll underground it, which will help out more. But as far as sea level rise, I've got to like look more deeply into this, but the city of Alameda, they did like a climate adaptation and resilience plan. And I don't know like to what extent we'll be able to do this, but I think something like a seawall might be might be useful. It's just like it's just tough to like, or rather it's like it's just painful to know that we're gonna have like no money like for like so long. But those are like some of the ideas I've been like, you know, playing with in my like sandbox imagination.
Yeah, so if folks are asking questions in Q&A there, I'm not sure if they're coming up, or maybe we're, you know, impressing everyone with our conversation so far and people don't have any questions. But if you're having trouble, you might try dropping them in the chat as well, just to make sure we see it. Yeah, so, you know, we've kind of touched on this theme a few times of the interaction of the pandemic with these issues. And, you know, it's a challenging time. I don't know if you have any thoughts about sort of like if there are any kind of opportunities to sort of you know, learn from this experience with the pandemic and enhance resiliency and sustainability moving forward. And I guess on the flip side, if there's things that it's sort of taking off the table because of lack of funding right now, if there's like other things we could focus on that are less expensive, don't require as much upfront investment, but can still help achieve some of these goals.
Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, like I think like with as far as like capital projects and improvement goes, I think quick build bicycle infrastructure is going to be big, because a lot of folks are not going to want to take transit, but to get them to not, you know, retreat into their cars, we're going to need to make the road safer for bicycles and pedestrians. That's I know I sound like a broken record with that, but that's like the big takeaway is, okay, well, like we can't do like massive road work, but we can, you know, put in some quick build. You know, granted, of course, we're going to want to do as much community outreach, especially I think, you know, to understand how folks are getting to work. And another thing too is I think that like working from home like is great, but we want to make sure that folks, more folks can have that option. And so like, so maybe more long term, we want to like prioritize like lifelong skills building so that folks can adapt to like changes to the economy. Like, you know, if someone's used to, you know, someone has a job that they can't work from home, how do we get them a new job? How do we create jobs to respond to the needs that we have? So I think like rethinking education and economy will be important as well. And I think that like you know, I think if we do have buildings that are, you know, for example, you know, like have significant affordable housing, are you know, are maximum efficient, they're electrified, they're on a corridor, there's no parking spaces, they're doing transit passes, right? We should prioritize these projects. Because like one fear that I have is that, well, like I don't like, we're already like, you know, we're already gonna have students not coming back, right? I don't want to see my city empty out. I want people to still live here, and I want people to still be able to move here. I think that like to meet our challenges, to survive COVID, to survive climate change, we need to have folks who are working here and living here and thinking along with us. So, sorry, that's kind of like a nebulous and tangential answer, but I think that those are my takeaways from the way that the pandemic is like hitting the city.
So the related question came up. So, you know, with the challenges for public transit right now, either based on real data or to some extent perceived safety challenges with transit. Can you discuss ways that you would, this is a question from Elizabeth Blackburn, can you discuss ways that you would proceed to get public transit safer for those whose situations prevent cycling from being an option for their work?
Right. So I think like pressing MTC and the state and the Fed to allocate more resources to AC Transit and BART so that they can maintain safety standards and provide PPE to their workers is first and foremost. I think that we're gonna need, in order to maintain physical distancing on buses, we'll need to run more buses more frequently. And we're going to need, I think for that, we're going to need bus rapid transit, bus lanes to maintain the efficiency of the routes.
Yeah, that's definitely something that, is I think about a lot as not actually requiring that much resources, right? Because it's using the existing roads, but it requires a reallocation of space. So that's political resources, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of questions kind of picking up on the concerns about gentrification. What one attendee asks, how do you think improvements are best balanced with accelerating gentrification? And then Matthias Oosterbrook, if I'm pronouncing right, asks more specifically, given gentrification associated with improved bicycle infrastructure, parks, and other public resources, what ideas do you have for Berkeley to minimize racialized displacement going forward?
So, there are, I have to say that in Southwest Berkeley, where there is a tradition of African-American homeownership and African-American tenants, people have wanted improved public resources and parks for a long time. It's unfortunate that that demographic turnover has preceded these improvements. They're also I have to keep saying, in Berkeley, people of color are more likely to be hit by cars than anyone else, cyclists and pedestrians. So it's important for people of color who are still here to enjoy the infrastructural upgrades, the public resources, the parks that we've been denied for generations. But to minimize racialized displacement going forward, we're gonna need to make sure that Black and brown children who grow up can and go through our schools can get jobs here and stay here. There has to be a pathway for employment that allows folks of color to stay in our neighborhoods. My folks have been here for 3 generations. All my grandparents came here together, and they worked hard. They got their houses. My dad's mom is still here. My mom's mom sold her house. Now they all have houses in Vallejo. And my nieces, my nephews don't get to go to Berkeley schools, and they're all gone. But I think that part of displacement is making sure that people of color want to stay here. On top of the tenant protections and on top of the anti-displacement measures. There's no denying that the cost of housing is also what drives people away. So cities can't control the price of housing, but we can make it easier to facilitate innovative housing models like land trusts and equity restricted communal living. I mean, to really make, like, as a socialist, like, the dream is to create social housing or public housing or democratically controlled community-owned housing. But like to get there, we have to be able to build multi-family living. Well, we have to be able to build apartments for that. So I think that it's going to be a process where it's going to require making sure that folks of color have pathways to both employment and home ownership, or communal home ownership or whatever. On top of like tenant protection, on top of making sure that the buildings we live in are habitable.
Great. So there's a question about the hospital. You mentioned maintaining the hospital around. So what do you think Berkeley should do to, this is an anonymous question, to keep the hospital, and how does that tie in with your thoughts in general about urban planning?
I think on the urban planning side, we're gonna, yeah, I'll start with the urban planning side, right? So worst case scenario, we lose our hospital, right? We need to be able to build a new one, which is going to require zoning reform. In the interim, like for example, in West Berkeley in District 2, we've got like a number of medical clinics, lifelong medical. We've also have just a number of like medical bio labs. So facilitating the expansion of those kinds of folks who can help meet the needs of our sensitive populations. Because if we lose Alta Bates, then Albany loses it, and El Cerrito loses Alta Bates, and Emeryville loses Alta Bates, right? But if we can, work with our medical partners here in West Berkeley, and we also have like UCSF and folks like that are here, then we can kind of carry some of the weight. But to keep the hospital open, it's going to take immense public pressure. So I think this is where folks who are involved in organizing, like my friends in the GSA and in the Sunrise Bay area, and folks like that, we're probably going to have to like ride out and put like, because it's really like Sutter admin and corporate folks who are trying to close it because they don't want to pay for the earthquake upgrades, retrofitting. So I think it might come down to us, like really turning up the heat. So I think it's going to take kind of like a two-pronged or a multi-pronged approach: political pressure, public pressure. But we should also, try to get a new hospital built, or maybe we can find someone else who can operate the hospital, and pay for the upgrades. But yeah, but.
Yeah, so one person, Linda Curry, was asking about the slow streets. Linda points out 60% or more of Berkeley's emissions come from transportation. How can we quickly expand and ramp up healthy streets and make corridors that are slower and safe for people to walk and bike in your district and beyond? So far, there are just 3 streets implemented in Oakland, SF, and other cities. They've implemented similar programs that are much more expansive. Although I'll note, I think Oakland's has implemented far more than San Francisco.
Yeah, so I'm a member of Walk Bike Berkeley, and we're kind of the force behind Berkeley's Healthy Streets. And we've been frustrated with the city's rollout. They've been giving us a non-committal implementation. But yeah, it's kind of for Berkeley. I think it's going to come down to like hounding the council members and the city manager to ramp it up, because it took them like a month of us like really like roasting them, to even get them to put up the little signs on 9th Street. I was on the phone with someone from Oakland DOT like a few weeks ago, and like we're talking about how can we, expand Berkeley's network to Oakland's network, and then and make those permanent, eventually. But yeah, I think that it's gonna, I think folks in Berkeley are gonna have to really press council. If you can stomach it, come out to a council meeting and speak during public comment on non-agenda items, or like the policy committee meetings that are happening. Not all of them are, but I think some of them are. Yeah, like writing letters, calling Jesse, the mayor. Because I mean, it is an election year, so if council members get the sense that this will be a big issue, they'll be more they'll be more receptive, I think. I mean, staff has their hands full, but if they get the sense that this is like a necessary like health and safety concern of like a large segment of the public, then they'll be more open to committing.
Thanks. So another anonymous question, have you seen any progress on long-standing East Bay issues, such as housing or zoning, as a result of the recent mass protests?
Housing or zoning as mass protests? I think there's also a question about how to create more low-income housing. I think that like if we get cities to demilitarize their budget, if we can cut the military police spending, and that funding can go towards subsidizing low-income units in multi-family buildings, if that can go to, I mean, if in an ideal world, if we cut the budget such that we have enough money in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund or something, that we can acquire our own parcels, that we can build permanently affordable housing, that would be wonderful. But then again, we would be competing against, increasing mental health services and crisis response services. But yeah, but my hope is that the defunding the police conversation will give us more funding to create low-income housing, whether that's increasing the inclusionary homes in bigger buildings, or I think here's best case scenario, right? Like, let's say in Alameda County we get like Oakland and Berkeley and everyone to cut police, and this is me just like thinking out loud. So like, if it's impossible, like, sorry, but let's try to make it possible together. Like if we get all the cities to defund their PDs to the point where we can pool money to identify like a large space in the county to like put like a real like RV sanctioned encampment like place where folks have access to basic utilities like hygiene and waste removal. That's like, that's what I would like to see coming out of this. And also, individual cities bankrolling more low-income housing construction. But like, we're not gonna like, but if cities continue to rely on like private development, then we're not gonna be able to really leverage what we need to leverage in a way to house the families that we want to house. So I think it's going to take a lot of like creativity and public pressure and strategy, if that makes sense.
So an anonymous question, many people in Berkeley are now out of work and rents have been furloughed for now, but at some point in the near future, they may face evictions if they can't pay their rent. What can we do to keep people in their existing housing?
Can you repeat the question?
Many people in Berkeley are now out of work and rents have been furloughed for now, but at some point in the near future, they may face evictions if they can't pay their rent. So what can we do to keep people in their existing housing?
Right. So I think like the city and the county need to make the eviction moratorium like permanent, and like I think that folks should not have to pay back that rent. I think that like for the pandemic, the rent should be like legit like canceled. Um, 'Cause I think that like yeah, because I'm just like I'm like super afraid that like folks are going to be like evicted en masse. Um, so like I think like strengthening the eviction moratoriums, canceling rent, um, but that has to happen at the county and the city level and the state. And I think that like even with that, we're going to have to do like a massive like public education drive to make sure that like all tenants like know what their rights are and where their resources are located. Um, to avoid kind of like shady bad stuff.
So a question that we get a lot is this is an anonymous question. Would building more affordable housing create more influx into Berkeley and therefore negate the effect of supplying more affordable housing, in addition place more burdens on infrastructure?
I think like there are families who have been on like the affordable housing wait list for like years, and I don't like. I think that like if like low income families need to be housed, they need to be housed, and if we can build that housing, we should build it. Um, Obviously, we want to, prioritize our infrastructure to like maintain that, but that's our job anyway. But like I think that like it's kind of our job to make sure that low income families can live in Berkeley, um, especially considering like District 2 being like you know like uh like we like West Berkeley, District 1, District 2, that we are like where like all of the manufacturing, mixed use, light industrial zoning is, and we are where the, like it's like the university and Bay are the two largest employers, and then like there's like a lot of like there are just a lot of jobs historically in West Berkeley, so like folks should be able to live where the jobs are. Um, so yeah, I mean, I like I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but like I want to see the first like affordable housing mega tower. You know what I mean? Like I want to see like a public housing like castle go up. You know what I mean? Like our that's our goal, is to have like you know like uh income inclusive an income inclusive populace is our goal.
Great. So we're almost out of time for the formal section, and we might, after we close, you might stay on for another few minutes to see if there's any, if we can answer any additional questions in a smaller group. But to the interest of letting folks go that need to drop off. But first, do you have any kind of final thoughts or kind of things that we didn't get to that you wanted to bring up?
Well, yeah, I think we should just like we talk about housing and we talk about cities for to support human life. We should also think about how cities can support biodiversity. I think that parks came up earlier. I think that parks are a great example where we can have we can create and sustain local ecologies. And I think that our buildings can do this as well. If there are ways to create like deeply green buildings that consider, migratory bird patterns, or I think I would love to see like medians that are entirely built around pollinators and their migratory patterns and things like that. So just I want to like push for this like nexus of like housing, ecology, and equity.
Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. Um, so just to close, Urban Environmentalists is part of the YIMBY Action Network, dedicated to solving the housing shortage and building inclusive communities. You can visit us at www.urbanenvironmentalists.org, and you can also support us by becoming a member of YIMBY Action at yimbyaction.join. And you can also visit eastbayforeveryone.org to learn more about East Bay for Everyone. Terry, how can people find out more about you and your campaign?
I'm linking my website in the chat. Folks can, if you go to Terry for Berkeley, it'll redirect you. I'm on Twitter at Taplin Terry. I'm on Facebook. I always forget my Facebook URL, but you can just search Terry Taplin. You can also like request me at my personal one. Yeah, and Instagram, Kelp Gardens, Terry for Berkeley.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and so we'll let folks drop off that need to, and we'll stay on like maybe another 10 or 15 minutes to see if folks have additional questions. One person is really excited about pollinating car doors. I'll note that as a done question. Eric Ruud, if I'm pronouncing it right, asks, you mentioned that public pressure and community organizing will be necessary to win things like social housing and investment in transportation, safety, and environmental justice for frontline communities. How do you think we can generate the enthusiasm to get this stuff done?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of energy going on in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and I think like building on that and showing how that struggle intersects with those things is one way to open a path between. And I mean, I think good old social media agitation also, and getting folks to like join like East Bay TSA, Bay Area Sunrise, and any of their other local like volunteer orgs.
Yeah, and then there was, I guess there was the question earlier that we partially answered by Josh Oosterbrook about when we do more development, what are your thoughts to make sure that includes more low-income housing that's to be created along with the overall housing? And I think you talked about that a lot already. I was just going to add onto that, like, what do you think is the role of market rate housing specifically in complementing or providing funding for affordable housing, and are there other funding sources that you might explore that would be more equitable than our current sources of funding,
right?
beyond the ones you already mentioned?
Yeah, I just want to say that single-family housing is not affordable housing or low-income housing, and that we never have to like justify single-family homes for some reason. But I think like for me, it's like the role, like the market rate has to subsidize low-income housing. Like I don't really see like a 100% market rate apartment building. Like that would be really, I mean, that would be really, I don't think that would work for Berkeley. Just because I think that it's so important for us to have like inclusive housing. So for me, every building has to have low-income units. It's just a matter of like how many can we get, right? So for me, like removing parking minimums to open up more space for low-income units, like combining funding sources. Are there state grants? Are there federal grants that we can use as a city to because we have like Measure O, so there are bond measures, but like, you know, how, so it's like a mix of like bond measure money, like market rate subsidizing, and grants. I think that way we can include more low-income housing. I mean, the city, to really do our job as a city to house like low-income families, we are going to need like social housing and public housing. It's just a question of like, where can we build it and how do we pay for it? And so it's going to take a lot of like alignment with like the state and the Fed and the county. But I do think it's possible. And I think that it's the job of our electeds to identify those funding sources. I mean, we're going to be playing defense against COVID for a long time. But that is our job.
Great.
Oh wait,
It looks like. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Also, public banking. I think that's something we can start tapping into more.
Can you say a little bit more about how you see that role?
Right. I think, you know, utilizing public banks as one of the streams of funding for to get more low-income units inside of mixed income construction, or in helping land trust finance acquisition.
Great. It looks like we managed to get to everyone's questions. So this was a really, really informative conversation, and really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. And wish we had a live venue so we could have people applaud you, but we'll have to just close it up here.
Yep. Also, folks can write me if they want to keep the conversation going, because like, you know, like these are all like really tough, complicated questions, and you know, I don't know everything in the universe, and I get a lot from exchanging with folks, so, and I'm really available time-wise, so feel free to write me. I'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. Thanks everyone for coming, and make sure to follow our website and our email list to join us at a future event.